How often have you felt restricted to spiritual practices that seem outdated and of little relevance in today's world? Are you discouraged to express your own creative talents and develop spiritual practices that are uniquely you? The Liturgical Rebels podcast is for people just like you who want to reimagine and reconstruct their faith and spiritual practices. It's for those who want to reshape belief and journey closer to God's wholeness with peace, justice, and flourishing, not just for themselves, but for the earth and all its inhabitants. In this inaugural episode, Sine and Forrest Inslee discuss what it means to be a liturgical rebel and why it matters. They discuss how we enhance our faith by connecting to the God revealed in nature, in creativity, and the everyday acts of life. They encourage us to explore our own pathways to discover spiritual expressions that resonate in our souls, strengthen our faith, and nourish our spirits. Welcome to the Liturgical Rebels podcast. Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Liturgical Rebels podcast. Today I have with me my good friend Forrest Inslee, who's the host of Earthkeepers podcast. And Forrest has been tremendous help to me in setting up this podcast. Together we will introduce you to the ideas behind the Liturgical Rebels, its goals, and some of the guests I will be interviewing over the next few weeks. So welcome, Forrest, and thank you for your help with this.
It's awesome to be with you. I'm excited for this project.
Well, thank you. Do you want to start by just telling us a little about yourself?
Sure. I did some counting and realized that I have been a friend of yours for 18 years now. Can you believe that?
Amazing. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah. So, I've known you for 18 years, and primarily it was through the community at your intentional community, Mustard Seed House, but also in working, volunteering with you for many years with Mustard Seed Associates, which I'll note eventually became Circlewood, which eventually launched my podcast, The Earthkeepers. Mm-hmm. So I'm a podcast for Circlewood, a podcaster, but also I'm the associate director. So I'm also involved in different educational and advocacy initiatives that we do for the environment.
Wonderful. Well, Forrest, I didn't realize it was 18 years, but I knew it was quite a while. And I know how you've helped me, particularly in the last few years, to shape some of my approach to spirituality and some of what we'll be talking about here. Just to introduce myself a little bit more, I am an Australian physician, trained in Australia, then practiced in New Zealand, and then in 1980 joined what was then part of Youth with a Mission and has now become Mercy Ships. And I was involved with the ships for 12 years, headed up the Mercy Ships program in the early days, the medical side of the Mercy Ships program, and actually developed the medical program that has now, of course, become the mainstay of Mercy Ships. Then Tom and I were married almost 32 years ago now. And when we were married, obviously, I gave up Mercy Ships, and I also decided to give up medical practice, partly because I had a growing interest in spirituality and a more kind of diverse approach to spirituality. Some of the experiences I had me really questioning the way that I'd been taught to practice my faith. And I wanted to explore other ways of practicing my Christian faith. And so I started writing, and I also took over Mustard Seed Associates, and the land that we had out on Camino Island, which has now become Circlewood, and particularly was involved with facilitating some Celtic retreats that we did, actually 25 retreats over 25 years, one each year. And that was a great experience for me. And in some ways, I think was probably the beginnings of my kind of exploration of out-of-the-box spirituality that kind of made me into a liturgical rebel.
So you obviously are involved in a lot of things these days, which are helping people, I think, to explore those things for themselves. You mentioned your writing, and in particular, I want to note the importance of your blog, God Space, which I think influences many people and kind of helps them to experience a lot more freedom in their faith practices than they would otherwise. But given all that, given the things that you do, the ways that you teach and write for people, why a podcast now? Why does that make sense to you in the kind of bigger picture?
Well, part of it is that I'm finding that much as I enjoy God Space, I don't always have the opportunity to both express myself, some of the things that I'm thinking about and working on, but also it doesn't give me the opportunity to interact with some of the people that I have found are wonderful liturgical rebels and that I would like to introduce other people to a lot more as well. I'm excited about this, partly because it's an opportunity for me to keep exploring. I used to ask people the question, what makes you feel close to God? And I would say that 10, 15 years ago, the two major answers I would get is something to do with nature and something to do with being together with kids. But I've noticed in the last 5 years or so, a growing number of people are talking about creativity. And I think that I would say now that the two major things that make people feel closer to God are some aspect of nature and some form of creativity. And I find that whereas I can use God Space to introduce people to some creative practices, I feel that a podcast is a much better way to do that at this point.
Yeah, I think that what you're talking about takes on a special importance these days as so many people are struggling with perhaps past iterations or expression of their faith life and are really looking for ways to find more alive, more relevant, more engaging ways to practice their faith and to engage God. So from my point of view, this is very timely. I think that people are probably hungry for a lot of what you hope to deliver in the podcast.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, one of the things I think that has concerned me over the last few years is I see a lot of people talking about deconstructing faith and a lot fewer people talking about reconstructing faith. What do we want to hold on to? What do we need to reshape? What do we need to renew and refocus sometimes as well? And that's really what I want to focus on in this, because there are a lot of practitioners out there who have really developed ways to reconstruct faith that don't look much like the traditional practices that we're used to. Some of them have just kind of reshaped traditional practices. Others have developed totally new forms of practice. And it really is exciting to see the different approaches to Christian faith and spiritual practices that are out there now, and that I think that we need the opportunity to explore. It doesn't mean we have to grab hold of them all, but it gives us new opportunities. And I think I really started to explore some of this, I think, in my book, The Gift of Wonder, and introduced people to a lot of new possibilities in terms of spiritual practices. But I think that since I wrote that, it's almost 5 years ago now, the other possibilities have just blossomed. And it's exciting to see there's something out there for everybody in terms of an approach to Christian spirituality, I feel.
Yeah, I really want to pick up on your balance that you noted between deconstruction and maybe reconstruction, because I do know that for many Christ followers, that is a point of worry. Like if I begin to question these practices, even the theologies that I've been taught for so many years, what does that then do to my faith? Where does that
Yes.
leave me? And I think that's a scary place to be. And so people may end up not bothering to do any kind of critique or deconstruction. But what you're saying is that all deconstruction leads to the end of reimagination of what could be. And
Exactly.
I think that your word rebels ties into this. And I'm curious why you use that term liturgical rebels, and what does it mean for you, and what should it mean for people who are first approaching the podcast? How do they read that?
Well, actually, the term was first applied to me by another good friend, Paul Sparks, who was one of the authors of The New Parish. And I was telling him about some of the practices that I was instituting for Advent, because I'd said to him, I am totally bored with the traditional Advent wreath. And so I was telling him about how I was reinventing Advent wreath for me as an Advent garden and the things that I was using. And he said, "You're a liturgical rebel, you know." And it's kind of stuck in my mind. And I thought, yes, I am. I like the foundations of the liturgy. You know, when I first discovered the liturgy, probably 25, 30 years ago now, it was like a breath of fresh air. I loved the church calendar. I didn't grow up with that, and I just loved it and all that it brought to my faith. But maybe partly because I'm an experimenter, it kind of got to the point where I thought, I don't want to use only traditions or only practices that have been established for hundreds, if not thousands of years. I want to use practices that really connect me to the world that I live in now. And that's when I really started getting into developing new kinds of practices, sometimes drawing on the old practices. I still practice Advent and Lent and Christmas and these seasons, but I like things that really come or make me come to life in ways that I sometimes find that the old traditions don't. So that's what I mean by a liturgical rebel. Part liturgy, part rebel, I suppose you could say.
Why do you think people might hesitate to perhaps practice rebellion as you are describing it? What is it that makes people hesitant or afraid in your experience?
I think part of it is that churches, generally speaking, do not encourage creativity. In fact, some of them totally discourage creativity. In fact, I was reading something the other day that evidently Augustine basically said that we don't need to be creative because God's done it all for us, type of thing. And I thought, oh, I just, that kind of really was a shame to hear that being said, because I think that part of who God has made us to be is to be creative. We all like to be creative, whether it be cooking or crafts or music or whatever. I think all of us are creative people in different ways. And so I think that we need to tap into that creativity, because I think it's one of the ways, certainly for me, it's been one of the ways that draws me closer to God. When I'm creating something new, boy, I just feel that spark of God's presence in a way that nothing else has a tendency to do for me.
I think that's really an important value that you're bringing out that underlies this podcast. You're not actually prescribing people a set of new ways to practice.
No.
It sounds like instead you're teaching people to generate new ways of practice. And they may try some of the things that you recommend, right? But it's all to the end of them being creative enough to create new faith practices, new ways of understanding that are relevant to their context, to their life, to their particular needs. Is that what I'm hearing?
Exactly. Yes, very, very definitely. In fact, nothing gives me more joy than to have people respond to what I've said and said, "Hey, look, this is what I did as a result of that." And it's like, wow, I never would have thought of that. But something that I said sparked something in them that really meant that their creativity could emerge. And that is exactly what I want to see happen, because I don't want people to say, oh, I need to follow your creativity. I want people to say, wow, just as God sparked creativity in her, I believe that God can spark creativity in me as well. And I think that is very important for us.
So when you think about your future listeners, what is it that you hope they're going to take away from the podcast? And what can they expect actually as they listen to you and your guests from episode to episode?
Well, first of all, my hope is to introduce them to people who are creative. And the place that I'm starting, I know that over the Christmas season, many of us were impacted by Kelly Lattimore's icons. And, he did the one that Christ under the rubble, being born, the Holy Family under the rubble, just very, very powerful icon. And he has some others, the Holy Family in Tent City, the Holy Family as a refugee and things like that, just helping us to kind of break outside our kind of perception of where Christ is being born in our world today. And I just love that. So he is going to be one of my first guests on this podcast. And then another person that's really impacted me, or a couple of people, one of them is a poet, Drew Jackson. He's a Black poet, wonderful, has 2 books out, Touch the Earth and God Comes Through Wombs. And I have just found this to be such a powerful kind of approach to stir my connections to God. And I think for many other people as well. And he talks social justice, but in a gentle way that kind of gets to your heart without kind of making you kind of feel as though you need to turn your back on what he's saying. And then the third person that many of us are probably familiar with is Scott Erickson. And he's an artist who a couple of years ago wrote an Advent book called Honest Advent and has several other books out as well. And I'm looking forward to talking to him about, again, his approach, because, again, I see him, he's got the liturgy there, he does Advent, but boy, does he do it in a very powerful and different way. And so there's some of my first guests. And so what I'm hoping that people will take away from this is, firstly, a dissatisfaction with same old, not creativity for the sake of creativity, but creativity for the sake of helping us to draw closer to God and helping us to be strengthened in our spiritual practices. So that's number one. And secondly, I'm hoping that people will be exposed to some new forms of spirituality that might help them in their own process of reconstruction. Forrest, I think that you are one of the people who has inspired me to both be a liturgical rebel and who has seemed to be a liturgical rebel to me in some ways. So let me ask you a few questions. Firstly, what makes you feel close to God?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that the primary way that I engage God is through nature, which is pretty typical of people in the Pacific Northwest where we live. But I think just generally speaking, you'll find a lot of people that really understand that their spirituality, that their connection to God happens in great part through their experience of nature around them. My story, though, is kind of pretty typically evangelical in the sense that I was part of an evangelical church in Chicago where I did my undergrad and graduate studies. And at one point, I thought about moving from Chicago back to the Pacific Northwest because I had this dream of helping to build churches that acknowledged and celebrated this approach to faith practice. And in my mind, it was a new idea, even though so many of my friends actually connected in the same ways that I did. But my pastor at the time said to me, well, God didn't die for the mountains and the trees. And That's typical, right, of the American
Yes.
evangelical mindset, which prioritizes saving human souls and evangelism and really downplays the value of non-human creation. And I don't blame him. I probably would have said the same thing to someone else if they asked me, because I had been steeped in that kind of evangelical dualism, really, that devalued the created world. So, ironically, the next step for me was not to return to the Pacific Northwest, but to become a missionary. So I did that for a number of years. Somewhere along the line, I did seminary work and was exposed to the writing and teaching of Peter and Miranda Harris, who were founders of Arosha, which is a Christian conservation organization. And through them, I was exposed to the idea that God loved all of creation, that God's plan of redemption extended to all creation, both human and non-human. In other words, that God did die for the mountains and the trees. And that really kind of set me free. It freed up a part of me that I had been suppressing. It freed me to believe what I inherently knew in my heart anyway. And I decided I really wanted to be part of that broader work of redemption that involved all creation. Eventually, I returned to the Pacific Northwest and found you and Tom, got involved in Mustard Seed Associates, and there was plenty of room in that context, obviously, for me to be that person I think God had called me to be. And so that, in turn, led to my getting involved with the podcast and with the educational work that Circlewood does now. So yeah, I would say that my story is one of being set free, not so much of rebellion, right? I didn't feel like I had a lot of permission to explore these ideas, which were kind of foreign to the evangelical context. But perhaps through the rebellious work of Peter and Miranda Harris, they helped me to understand what was really true and to have a better theology about creation.
Wonderful. Tell us a little bit about the Earth Keepers podcast, because I think, what I've gained from the Earth Keepers podcast is some of that thinking outside the box, some of the guests that you have on, as well as the work that Circlewood do. So tell us a little more about that.
Sure. The work of the podcast and of Circlewood, in great part, is a reflection of my story. That is, Circlewood helps people who believe on some deep level that God is revealed in nature and that our work as Christ followers has to involve the work of creation care. So as an organization, as a podcast, we seek really to affirm these impulses in people and to undo the work of the Western church that has convinced them that this beautiful world we live in is just going to burn someday, that nothing matters but saving souls for heaven, and that it has nothing to do with really the earth. So I see my work as helping to build a supportive community of like-minded earth keepers. And I think importantly, it's not that we're introducing a whole new idea to people, but more finding the people who already know this on some deep level, right? And so in some ways, the work of the podcast and of Circlewood is to set people free to believe what they already know and to affirm those beliefs. Some of the deconstruction of the false beliefs when it comes to creation that we help to do is leading people to discover new understandings and new perspectives and really a healthy whole theology. And for that, we sometimes look to diverse traditions around the world. So we often go outside of the Western context to learn from other people who may have a different way of perceiving the world that can help us and inspire us to think differently. For example, we love exposing people to the beliefs and practices of indigenous people who can teach us things like how to love non-human members of creation as our relatives. And they give us language and practices that help us to understand that we're all members of one big family of creation. At the same time, we hearken back to church history. And as you pointed out, the Celtic tradition is a great resource for modern people to understand what a more nature-integrated, creation-integrated faith practice could look like. Because in the Celtic Christian tradition, there was that valuation of elements of creation, non-human elements, being part of the world that that God made was good and was lovable and needed to be part of our work of redemption.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Yeah, I think, I have learned, like you, have been learning a lot from Indigenous people. And when I kind of started to realize that nature was a legitimate part of my spiritual observance and my spiritual
Mm-hmm.
life, as it was for you, it was so liberating. Um, and I've seen that same kind of liberation happen as many other people discover, uh, not just the beauty of nature, but the practices that can draw them closer to their Christian faith as
Yeah.
they are in nature. And it's one very important form of spirituality. And I remember when I first started to get into, kind of making connections between spirituality and the garden at that point, and that was probably 15, 20 years ago, most of the books that I could find were written by Zen Buddhists.
Hmm.
They were the ones that had connected in terms of nature at that point in time. And that was a very helpful kind of foundation. It wasn't that I wanted to become a Zen Buddhist, but there were some key lessons that I learned from them that set me on the trajectory to integrating nature into my Christian faith. And I'm very grateful for that. And yeah, looking outside the Christian boundaries or acceptable boundaries. Because even, one of the griefs from my childhood or my early Christian days, because like you, I was involved in the evangelical side of the church, was my aunt was a very strong Greek Orthodox Christian. And basically, I learned to dismiss her as a follower of Christ. And it was only when I was in my 50s, I think, that I realized, what an incredible follower of Christ she was, and was able to kind of react to her in a way that kind of learnt from her faith rather than dismissing it. And, again, I think that's something that we all need to do, is to think outside the boxes in which we grew up. And,
Well,
that's true for all of us.
it is. And I can guarantee that some people listening to this podcast are getting squirmy as we say these things, right? Because we have been taught to fear otherness.
Yes.
That even some Christian traditions have taught against being open to the new,
Yes.
considering that there could be value in the Zen Buddhist tradition. And I think that really this work of liturgical rebellion is also a work that requires courage.
Mm-hmm.
It's not for the faint of heart, because I think we've been conditioned not to listen. We've been conditioned to draw boundaries and hold to them. What that's resulted in is a very static kind of faith. But what you're advocating for is something much, much more alive, much more open, much more teachable. But I think you're also advocating for a courageous heart to be able to do those things.
I think you're right. I know when I first started stepping outside the boxes, it was scary. And I think that for some people, that's why when they do start to step outside, it's safer to deconstruct than to reconstruct, because to step away from can sometimes be a lot safer process than stepping towards something new and still kind of claiming something at the core, and so I think that's at least my assessment of part of the reason that we see a lot of people deconstructing and being afraid to reshape, reconstruct, and renew what's there, because it looks very different, and it's scary because you lose friends or you might lose friends in the process, and sometimes you don't know where you fit for a long period of time too. But boy, the release that comes and the closeness to God that comes as well, I think makes it all well worthwhile. I think God wants us to break out of our boxes and wants all of us to become liturgical rebels, I think.
I have a friend, Victoria Lewis, who was a founder of the Wild Church movement, which probably is just a term that makes people nervous too. She calls herself, she has a great term, I love it. She says that she is called to be an edge walker. So she
Yes.
walks along the edge of tradition and the edge of the new, right?
Amen.
But she really, I think her gift, her real strength is being able to allow people to walk alongside her on the edge, right?
Yes.
She's not standing outside tradition, standing outside the church saying, come follow me, but rather she's helping people to navigate that uncertain space that creativity requires really to happen.
Well, and that's what we want to do. That's what I want to do in the Liturgical Rebels podcast, is to really enable people to walk on that edge in different ways as well, because I think that is what it's about. I'm not encouraging people to give up their Christian faith. I'm encouraging them to strengthen their Christian faith by learning to be creative and to develop practices that are much more geared to life in the world in which we live today, rather than, we know the world has changed a lot in the last 2,000 years, and we need to grab hold of things that help us go through the changes, I think.
Mm-hmm. And to help create a church that is responsive to those changes in the world, right? Rather than a church that hunkers down and draws the boundaries and essentially becomes irrelevant over time.
Yes. Yeah, I think that encouraging creativity in people is something that churches should all be involved in. But of course, the scary thing for churches is that when you allow people to be creative, they might find they no longer fit in your church. And so they want to do something new. And giving people permission to do that is courageous. And it's challenging as well, or it can be quite challenging as well. So, but it's exciting. It's exciting. And I think that this journey into liturgical rebellion is an exciting one as well. So thank you. Thank you, Forrest, for helping me to introduce people to this new podcast. Thank you for being one of my encouragers along the way to developing it as well. And thank you for all of the things that you do with Earthkeepers and with Circlewood as well. I very much appreciate it.
Oh, it's been an honor. Thank you.
Thanks. In this inaugural episode of the Liturgical Rebels podcast, I have been in conversation with Forrest Inslee about what it means to be a liturgical rebel and how you too can burst out of the confines of traditional practices to discover new ways to express your faith. For more information about Forrest, be sure to check out the show notes at godspacelight.com/podcast or visit Forrest at earthkeepers.online or circlewood.online. I am Christine Sine, author of The Gift of Wonder and facilitator of the Godspace Light website. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the podcast, or follow me on Instagram and Facebook. In the next episode, I will chat to Drew Jackson, whose fantastic poetry is part protest, part biblical commentary. He provides a fresh perspective on the gospel story as he weaves the biblical narrative with contemporary issues of justice, lament, and hope. A real liturgical rebel, if ever I met one.